Sig Tobias is actually a neighbor of mine down the street. I happen to live at the Cascades, some of you know, north of University. So I've known him for quite a few years. He's also a tennis buddy of mine. And that's pretty much how we met, although we've seen each other at Temple Beth Shalom. Yet he's a member of another nearby neighbor, Temple. His background is very intriguing. As you saw from the notice about this speech, he's had a career as a distinguished professor of psychology with emphasis on educational training and educational technology. He has unique experiences that as a very young child, he went to Shanghai post haste with his family to get out of Berlin, made it with his immediate family, and ultimately got to the United States. But that's his story that he is going to tell in greater detail. His book is fascinating. I recommend it to you. I just finished reading it yesterday, Strange Haven, A Jewish Childhood in Wartime Shanghai. But you don't have to read it today. Right now, you're going to hear it from his very mouth. Sig, you're on.
Thank you, Ed, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me. First of all, can you all hear me?
Perfect.
Okay, good. The only correction I wanted to make about the introduction you printed, I was not at SUNY, I was at CUNY. My whole career was at the City University of New York, and I did have an honorary appointment at the State University at the end of my career. I'm happy to speak to Beth Shalom. We belong to Congress, as I indicated, conservative shuls for over 30 years in Pittsfield and in New Jersey. And as a matter of fact, we spent the first 2 Shabbat services at Beth Shalom. And it's too bad that this meeting is via Zoom because I very much enjoy, Beth Shalom is a really nice place. But history has shown Jews to be an adaptable people. So since we can't be there in person, we're Zooming. So we are Zooming. My story really begins with Kristallnacht. Let me read to you an excerpt from my book. I will only read twice, so don't worry. It will not, otherwise I won't read because this is rather meaningful to me. I was 6 years old in Kristallnacht in Berlin, and I was born in 1932, and of course, Kristallnacht was 1938. We kept the curtains in our apartment drawn and used no lights to make it appear as if no one was home. My parents told me to be as quiet as possible. We tiptoed around the apartment in our socks, made do with running water, and did not use any knives, forks, or plates. My mother prepared enough sandwiches for the whole day and put them on a kitchen table along with cups of milk and water. When my parents brought me a sandwich, I forced myself to swallow a few bites. The finger in front of their pursed lips made it impossible to tell them that it hurt me to swallow because my throat was so dry. We spent most of that day and night in bed, getting up only when we had to. Kristallnacht passed slowly in darkness and in silence, interrupted only by our frightened reactions whenever the sounds of shattering glass made their way into our apartment from the street below. After Kristallnacht had ended, I was safe to go out again. We finally left the apartment. I walked between my parents, clutching their hands. A Jewish family owned a grocery store near our house on Metzerstraße. I often went there to pick up things for my parents. The store was empty now. Its windows smashed and shattered glass was all over the sidewalk in front of the shop. I turned my face away from the words dirty Jew, Saujude in German, that were splattered on the wall next to the store. We walked quickly and headed towards the Rickerstraße synagogue. The synagogue was inside a large courtyard. When we got to the entrance, we saw a mound of smoking ashes in the center of the courtyard. I saw that the mound consisted of burnt prayer books and was terrified to recognize the chart handles of the Holy Torah scrolls sticking out of the center of the shimmering ashes. I was taught to honor and respect the Torah. I had learned that the whole congregation would have to fast if the Torah was dropped, even by accident during services. Now the Nazis had turned to the Torahs, had burned the Torahs as if they're nothing but trash. I suddenly knew that there was no safety for us anywhere. Fortunately, my father understood that as well and bravely decided to get out of Germany. Now, what is not usually understood, it was not difficult to get out of Germany. It was difficult finding a place that would accept us. All of the other countries in the world essentially had closed their doors. There was no place to go to. So what my father decided to do is he decided to get himself smuggled into Belgium, thinking that Jews might be safer there. He was caught by the Belgians, was sent him back to the Germans. The Germans imprisoned him in the Dachau concentration camp. Ironically, it seems strange in retrospect, of course, that saved our lives. Because had my father had made it to Belgium, the probability of us surviving would be very slight, because so much of the Belgian Jewish population was wiped out. Would have been very difficult. In any event, since we couldn't find a safe haven anywhere, my mother was informed that my father would be released if he could leave. If he could leave, he wouldn't need to go into try to be smuggled into Belgium. It turned out that you go to Shanghai in China, the Japanese occupied part of Shanghai, without a visa. My mother immediately arranged for him to leave on a German freighter called the Fulda to Shanghai. And it was one of the few places in the world where Jews could go to without visas. About 17 to 20,000 Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria and Poland eventually made their way to Shanghai as well. After my father left, my mother got rid of whatever we could, and then we followed 6 months later. In 1939, we arrived in Shanghai. We lived in Hongqiu, which is the poorest. Those of you who have been to Shanghai, Hongqiu is across the second bridge. It is now called Hongkou. It is it was then and is now, I guess, the poorest part of Shanghai. It was an enormous shock to us. The first thing we saw were shells of bombed out buildings from the Sino-Japanese War, which started in 1937. I was also shocked to see human beings pull people in carriages, rickshaws. I'd never seen rickshaws before, of course. Occasionally, there were corpses on the street. They're picked up once a week. We learned that if you called to have them picked up, you had to pay for the expenses of picking it up. So essentially, corpses gathered once a week. Most of the refugees, not all, but most of the refugees lived in lanes. Lanes are sort of large courtyards of which houses branch. And typically in each house, there would be 7 families, and each family would have one room. We all had one shared toilet and one shared kitchen. And we were fortunate to have that, because other places were much worse shape. Initially in Shanghai, we had water closets like we do now. Eventually, after the war began, we had to move. We did not have that. And I don't need to tell you how awful it was to go into buckets, because the waste was picked up at dawn and most people had worms. And I know some of you having breakfast, so I won't describe to you how terribly awful that was. In any event, the group homes were people who could not afford to live independently, even in these one rooms. They were group homes, we called them Heime, and they were supported by wealthy Jews from Baghdad and Russia who had arrived in Shanghai in 1917 and 20, and later also by the United States. And the group homes had virtually no privacy. There was a communal kitchen and very poor food. Shanghai, of course, was one of the great natural harbors. The ships from all nations tied up. There were many bars with 2 or 3-piece bands, and women dressed alluring dresses, and dancing quite closely with whatever sailor was there. You can imagine boys having their eyes fixed on what was going on inside. And typically we found that the alluring dancers would suddenly disappear. And we figured out pretty soon where they were going. There were also in Shanghai, one of the things that was very clear to us, there were streets lined, red light districts, lined with bordellos. You could tell what was going on because the only thing sitting in the window were women sitting there. So even though I was a kid, we all figured out what was going on pretty early. In terms of education, I started kindergarten in Berlin, but obviously I only attended a week or two because after that, the Nazi kids were waiting for me afterwards and it was not safe for me to be there. So when we went to Shanghai, there was an elementary school founded, as I said, by the help of Bakhtiari Jews called the Shanghai Jewish Youth Elementary School, SJYA we called it. It was supported by wealthy Jews from Iran. I was a very slow student in the secular school. It was difficult for me to learn to write. I had motoric difficulty writing. And on the other hand, I was, and that also made it somehow or other, I guess, spread to the fact I was doing poorly in secular school. On the other hand, I was an ace in Hebrew school. I really did well. We were studying Chumash and Rashi, and I was really pretty good at that. And one of the things that was going on, of course, in Hebrew school, no writing was required at all. And while reading was not difficult for me at all, I read, as a matter of fact, I read German and English and Hebrew. Writing was not under my, it was difficult for me. And consequently, the Hebrew school was very easy for me and I enjoyed it very much. In 1941, the yeshiva from the Polish city of Mir arrived in Shanghai, and their way was even stranger than ours. They fled from Poland to initially to Russia. They made their way across the Trans-Siberian Railroad to Vladivostok. From Vladivostok, they took a steamer to the Japanese city of Kobe. And you may all know the story of Chiune Sugihara, who gave them the visas to do that. I don't have the time to go into detail on that, but I'm sure many of you are familiar with Chiune Sugihara. And anyways, so they ended up in Kobe. In 1941, when the war broke out, the Japanese had about 17,000 of us in Shanghai. And then they had 2,000 or 3,000 Jews in Kobe that they didn't quite know what to do with. So from one day to the next, suddenly, all the Jews from Kobe, the Japanese moved them to Shanghai and suddenly they were settled there. And it ended up that the students of the Mir Yeshiva started to congregate and study and to daven in my father's synagogue, which was the Ohel Moshe synagogue for those who visited Shanghai. And they started to question me about what I had studied naturally. And at first they asked me questions, they were pretty simple. And the questions got more complicated. So I dealt with those. And then the questions got quite complicated and I guessed at some answers. Finally, the question got so complicated, I said, I can't deal with that. One of the most respected students in the yeshiva turned to the other guy and said, that's not a fair question. You would have trouble answering that. And he turns aside and he says in Yiddish, which means he has a good head. Well, I tell you, I was elated. Having had my difficulties in secular school, no one had ever said that about me. And when the yeshiva arrived in Shanghai, since I was good at the yeshiva and when we started learning Talmud, Baba Mitzvah, I pestered my parents till eventually, it took a couple of years, I quit secular school entirely and studied in the Mir Yeshiva full time. And one of the things which was interesting, is I think it initiated, as I look back on it, my interest in the scholarly life. Before that, I had no interest in that, but the Talmud really was a challenge to me and I enjoyed that. In 1941, when the war broke out, the Japanese took over all of Shanghai. Until then, Shanghai was a tripartite city. A third of the city was governed by France, a third by Britain, and a third by China. The Chinese part, of course, was overtaken over by the Japanese in 1937. After the outbreak of the war, of course, the Japanese controlled all of Shanghai. And under pressure, the Japanese interned the Jews in the ghetto in Shanghai, which was far away from service in the ships. Now, we didn't know that then, but history has shown that what was going on, I learned about this in the United States, that the Germans had sent Gestapo General Josef Meisinger to Shanghai. Meisinger was the butcher of Warsaw. He urged the Japanese, it was his idea to burn down the Warsaw Ghetto. When he came to the Japanese, he urged the Japanese to annihilate the Jewish population. He said, you could build gas chambers. But he said, the simplest solution for you is put them on a bunch of very old Chinese ships, tow them out to the Yellow Sea and sink us. To the everlasting credit of the Japanese, they could not see themselves as doing that. And what they did instead, in 41, all the Jews were required to go into live into a small section of Hankyu, which we, of course, immediately called a ghetto. And we spent the rest of the war in that ghetto. We had an administrator, a Japanese man who was an administrator of the ghetto, who was an interesting chap. He in order to go to work in Shanghai outside of the ghetto, you had to go and get passes to this man. His name was Kano Goya. Goya was a very rigid man, but he was paranoid, but his paranoia was not really malevolent. For example, he felt, as the major administrative officer, you should be dressed appropriately when you came to him and asked for a pass. Shanghai's temperatures are about the equivalent of Sarasota in the summer. So a refugee lady came asking for a pass wearing a halter top, which offended his sensibilities. He asked her, why are you dressed this way? And she said, well, it's very hot. He says, you're hot. And he had a bucket of water and he doused it with water. This is the kind of a thing he did. On the other hand, it was completely in his power. He could have done away with us. I could have killed as many people. No one was there to protect us. He maintained his sense of decorum as a Japanese administrator. And if you treated him properly with decorum and respect and stayed in the ghetto, you could stay out of trouble. No one was lined up. None of the refugees were shot or anything like that. 14 people did die because eventually we were all forced to live in the ghetto. And some of the refugees felt that perhaps the Japanese weren't really serious about the ghetto because they figured there was pressures from the Germans. And these people eventually were imprisoned. The prisoners were infected with lice with typhoid, and half of the people didn't survive the typhoid. Obviously, we have very limited medication to deal with such serious diseases at that time. Goya was also an interesting guy. He took violin lessons from one of the refugees, and his paranoia manifested itself in an unusual way. This refugee had a picture of the Emperor Napoleon on his wall, and Goya looked at Napoleon and says, there was a great man. I'm a greater one. I'm the Emperor of the Jews. Fortunately, as I indicated to you, he interpreted this in a more benevolent and malevolent way, because if it had been different, we would have been in a lot of trouble. But during the war, malnutrition was rampant. I recall my parents buying 1 or 2 ounces of butter and watching, making sure that I ate it, spread it on the bread. I remember vividly my mother walking out once with a plate. We had a communal kitchen, and she licked the last bit of butter off the plate because it was very precious, and they wanted me to have the best of everything naturally. My parents ate only margarine, smelly stuff, really dreadful stuff. During the war, we survived basically lots of rice, lots of kasha. There's something in German called Hirse, which is probably birdseed. Fruits, fresh fruits, and vegetable was dangerous because the Chinese farmers use night soil. So eat virtually no fresh food. All vegetables had to be boiled. All water had to be boiled. If you drank water from the tap, you risked serious illness. And there were a lot of people. We ended up filling 3 cemeteries in Shanghai, and digestive problems were rampant throughout the ghetto. And obviously, we also, TB was prevalent in Shanghai. I remember being in a streetcar once and seeing a man hemorrhaging from that, and it was a dreadful sight, with blood all over the place. And naturally, we had few medications to deal with these illnesses. As I told you, the Mir Yeshiva was in better shape than the rest of the community. It turned out after the war, we learned that the Vat Hatzal had supported them via Switzerland. And I profited from that too, because I got a minor stipend. After the war, I began to realize that the Mir Yeshiva preached the importance of charity and sharing. They practiced none of that. They shared none of their wealth that they had gotten from Switzerland, not even with the Orthodox members of the community. And afterward, really initiated a crisis of faith. And I never returned to the devout orthodoxy that during the war because of that, because it was clear to me that so much of that was hypocrisy. During the war, we often had air raids, and initially, we waved to the American planes because we figured they knew where they were and where we were. And of course they did. Then on July 17th, 1945, the ghetto was bombed and 31 Jews were killed in an American air raid, including many Chinese. It turned out after the war, we found out that there was a major Japanese communication center in the ghetto, which the Americans had tried to bomb. And of course, pinpoint bombing then isn't any more accurate than it is now, obviously. And that's how many refugees, and 31 refugees and many Chinese were killed. Gradually, it became clear to us that the Japanese were because of the bombardments, one of the things they did, which was extraordinarily generous of them. Shanghai, as some of you may know, has the world's second largest jail next to Sing Sing. And as the air raids became more intense, Shanghai had there were no shelters because you dig 3 feet, you hit water. One of the things the Japanese did, they made 2 administrative buildings in the ghetto, in the prison available to us, so that you're an air raid. Once after the 17th of July, it seems amusing now, but we all ran to jail for protection during the air raids because we knew that prisons were not bombed by international agreements. Well, fortunately, I met a man after the war who told me that they had planned an invasion of Shanghai, and he was in logistics. And he closed his eyes and he read off all the establishments in the street that he was in charge. The apparently invasion of Shanghai was planned for September or October 1945. And fortunately for us, of course, the war had ended. Because if it had not, many of the refugees would have been destroyed because there were no air raid shelters, there were no basements. During air raids, one of the things we learned that you stood inside of doors, because what we had seen when we arrived in Shanghai is when buildings had been destroyed, the doors remained. The doors were stronger than the retaining walls, and people clustered inside doorways during air raids. After the war, of course, this is amusing to us. We didn't know the war ended. There was no news. But suddenly, from one day to the next, we look around and the Japanese had disappeared. There were no Japanese. And then we heard that a tank had landed. It turned out, of course, that an American plane had landed with a Jeep. And none of us had ever heard of a Jeep, so we all thought it was a tank. And then the Americans came and things eased up. After the war, we get a lot of Army rations, sea rations. The rations that were most prized were the 10-in-1 rations because they had a lot of good food in them. And then after the war, what happened, this was 46, 47, was incredible inflation. When I left Shanghai in 1948, $1 American was worth 12 million Chinese dollars. My parents were left a year later. $1 American brought you 120 million Chinese dollars. Obviously, it was impossible to do any business. And the fact that the communists took over was an obvious conclusion because the economy was in a shambles by that point. Now, what happened was that in 1948, the state of Israel, which had existed 3 months, sent 3 little Greek ships to Shanghai, and they wore the Israeli flag, and this is still very moving to me. Any Jew who wanted could get on those and be taken to Israel. And we suddenly recognized, of course, if they had been in Israel, there would not have been a Holocaust. It makes an enormous difference. Fortunately, as I said, I came to the United States. I was born in Germany, and I was on German quota. And my aunt, who had survived the war by fleeing to Russia and was interned in Siberia, it was in the United States. So I came here. And then my parents followed me a year later because they were Polish quota and they had greater difficulty emigrating. And finally, well, let me say what was going on is that Congressman Emanuel Sella was a treasured name in our family because my parents couldn't emigrate because they were born in Poland. And after the war, an immigration law had been passed that basically that survivors of the Holocaust could emigrate into the United States outside of the usual quota restrictions. Congressman Sella passed a law essentially indicating that the Jews in Shanghai were displaced persons, such as Holocaust survivors. And therefore, suddenly, all the Jews in Shanghai could immigrate to the United States, those who could immigrate to the United States outside of the usual quota restrictions, which made it possible for my parents to join me in the United States a year after I arrived. When I came to the United States, I was extremely anxious because, you see, I had no secular education for 5 years. I studied only Talmud and the yeshiva. And I figured I would really have a very hard time in school. And I studied like a demon for my first midterms. And I got nothing lower than an A+ in any one of the tests. And after that, I realized that this was nowhere near as difficult as the Talmud I had studied. And I didn't study so hard. And I took a half-time job work and then later a full-time job. And my grades declined from A+ to B+. But I did well enough with the B+, and eventually got a degree at City College, working full-time during the day and going to school at night. And I majored in psychology. And then I decided that I wanted to have a career in school psychology and took a master's degree in school psychology at City College. The reason for picking that is that master's degree was free. The state of New York was supporting it because they needed school psychologists. I could not have afforded to pay for a master's degree. Fortunately, shortly thereafter, I met the love of my life, Laura. We are now celebrating our 66th anniversary. And Laura was working full-time, and I worked full-time, half-time during the semester, full-time during the summer. And eventually we were able to support ourselves sufficiently for me to take a PhD in clinical psychology. And eventually I ended up having a career at the City University of New York for over 35 years. I was at Brooklyn College for 4 years, at the City College of New York for 33 years. I then had another 4 years at Fordham, 5 years at Fordham University. And I visited the University of Pittsburgh. I had a very interesting and fulfilling academic career. I also spent a year at Florida State while I was on a leave. I've worked, in addition to the work I've done, I've consulted actively for the Institute for Defense Analysis for over 15 years, and also spent 7 summers, was invited by the Navy Personnel Research and Development Center to contribute to the research program, which seemed odd because I've always been a peacenik. We've always demonstrated For me to have such good relations with military psychologists was amusing. I never saw it as a contradiction, because I never supported any warlike intervention, nor was I asked to. I was free in the work I did for the Navy to pursue my own research, which I did. I published, as Ed alluded to the fact, very actively during my academic career. I have over 150 publications, articles, chapters, and books. I've had in addition to that, I've presented over 300 papers at a variety of professional meetings. And I've edited several professional journals and published a couple of books in the area. And I originated a series which is flourishing now, called Acquired Wisdoms, Lessons Learned by Distinguished Researchers. I'm not bragging about these achievements. I'm saying them because now we are very concerned about refugees entering the country. And the reason I'm talking about these accomplishments is that refugees contribute to this country. We are a country of refugees. We should think not only about what they take, but also what they contribute. I might mention that there are many former refugees from Shanghai who have made notable contributions to the United States. Michael Blumenthal was Jimmy Carter's Secretary of the Treasury. You've all heard of Peter Max, the artist, and Lawrence Tribe, who is a noted historian at Harvard. These all people lived in Shanghai with us. There are 3 widely published psychological researchers actually in the area. K. Werner Schei, who's done work in geriatrics, Peter Lowenthal, who has done work on the treatment of depression, and I might immodestly mention myself in that area. But it's not also well known. Of course, refugees have contributed significantly to this country. You think of Einstein, you think of Henry Kissinger, Mark Chagall. I can go through the list. I don't know how many of you were aware of the fact that Andy Grove, the founder of Intel, was a refugee to the United States, as was Salvador Dali, as was Sergey Brin, the founder of Google. So while we are concerned with refugees, let me point out that refugees have contributed significantly. Finally, in 1988, believe it or not, I was invited to return to Shanghai. And obviously, I jumped at the invitation. I was invited to be a visiting professor at the Shanghai Institute of Education. My task was to lecture to 85 high school principals. And I spent a month lecturing to them about my own research and development and learning from instruction. It felt as if I was walking through my own past. They gave me access to the Institute's automobile, and we frequently went back to the ghetto where I had been in all these years. And I had a sense of walking through my own past. I would like to conclude my talk by reading to you my comments to the principals on my last day before leaving Shanghai and returning to the United States. I'm happy to have been welcomed so warmly in today's Shanghai, much of the way about 16,000 other Jews were welcomed here almost 50 years ago. Had we not found safe haven in China then, most of us would not have survived, though 6 million of our relatives, friends, and other members of our people were killed during the Second World War. Even though our life here during the Second World War was not easy, we realized how lucky we were to have found shelter in Shanghai when we heard about the Auschwitz, Belsen, and Treblinka concentration camps. I am grateful to the Chinese people for having allowed us to live among them peacefully during that terrible time, and I'm happy to have been able to return. I was aware of being deeply moved while making these general comments, though I was surprised to hear my voice crack at the mention of the concentration camps. I'm just as moved by the memory of that event today. Thank you.
Professor Tobias, thank you very much for your amazing remark. It was the presentation was every bit as compelling and interesting as I know we all expected it to be. I'm going to open up the Q&A session right now. And Jonathan Goldberg had asked during chat to be the first to ask a question. So Jonathan, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Nuts. Did you keep
So Professor Tobias, the question is, did the Jews who were taking refuge in Shanghai at the time mix, I guess, socially with other unfortunates, such as the Russian aristocrats who also found themselves in the same situation?
No, we didn't really mix. But the Russian Jews were relatively generous to us. As a matter of fact, the synagogue in which we davened, Ohel Moshe Synagogue, had been originally used by the Russian Jews, and they essentially gave us the synagogue to use. The chief rabbi of Shanghai, Meir Ashkenazi, who ended up being a Lubavitcher Chassid, was also very generous to us, and he was a member of that community. There were also in Shanghai some Sephardic Jews. We didn't see them, of course, because once the war broke out, they were interned, they were British subjects. But the Russian Jews stayed out, and they were reasonably generous to us. Of course, life was difficult, but I think in general, it's fair to say that they're supportive. One of the things that I have everlasting gratitude for, that one of the Russian Jews, every Hanukkah came to our Talmud Torah, and 3 months earlier, the Chinese craftsman took imprints of our feet, and every year for Hanukkah during the war, we get a pair of new shoes from this Russian man, whose name at the moment I'm blocking on. So as I say, we did not have a great deal to do with them, but they were somewhat generous to us. There also was a Russian Jewish hospital, which was infinitely superior and better equipped than the refugee hospital in Shanghai. And as a matter of fact, in 1947, I had surgery in the Shanghai Jewish Hospital, which was founded by Russian Jews. Typically, the Russian Jews lived in the section of Shanghai, which had formerly been governed by France, and they were much better off than the refugees. Obviously, they had lived there for many years. Most of them had come between 17 and 21, so they had worked their up, and many of them were shopkeepers and other kind of entrepreneurs.
All right, thank you. So another question from chat is, what was the impact, if any, of the Sassoon family in Shanghai?
We knew of the Sassoon family. I do not know to what degree they supported the community. I suspect that they did. I don't have any first-hand information. I knew about the Russian Jews. I don't have any first-hand information about that. But we knew that they were there. And my guess is that they probably did support us. But I cannot speak to that. I don't have any information about it.
All right, thank you. Another question from chat is, how did your family support themselves while they resided in the Shanghai Ghetto?
When my mother, as I mentioned to you, was a Polish citizen, so she came out of Germany with some money. And with that, my father was in Shanghai, you didn't buy houses. Ostensibly, he rented them for 99 years. So he, in partnership with another man, rented a house, and we sublet rooms. So we had, in the house that we were living, there were 6 people who were our tenants effectively, and they paid us for a rental, which was part of making the living. The other thing my father did, my father was a peddler in Germany, and most refugees had bought stuff for which there was no use. Shanghai's climate was pretty much equivalent to Sarasota, probably warmer, a little colder in the winter, but warmer in general. And so my father made an additional living by buying stuff from the Jews that they had no use for and selling it in an open air market to both the Chinese and Japanese, anybody who wanted to buy them.
All right, thank you. Wait a minute. I do have another question here. Let's see. The Last Kings of Shanghai chronicles the Sassoon and Hardoon families in Shanghai. Oh, this is a comment from Isaac Calvaria. He says, the Last Kings of Shanghai chronicles the Sassoon and Hardoon families in Shanghai before, during, and after the war. All right, so what is the name of your book about Shanghai, and where can we buy it?
Ed showed you the book. They're called Strange Haven, A Jewish Childhood in Wartime Shanghai. You can get it from Amazon or any other bookseller.
Very good. Thank you. All right. So now I don't see any other questions in chat. If anyone has a question, please raise your hand and I will call on you as I see you. Anyone? I also have a bunch of blank screens. So if you're asking for a question and I can't see you, just unmute yourself and ask a question. Oh, wait a minute. Isaac, go ahead.
Yeah, for anybody visiting Shanghai, one of the most incredible tours you will ever have anywhere in the world is by Dvir Bargal, who does a tour of the Shanghai Ghetto. Absolutely brilliant tour. And one of the things that one of the messages I came away with is that there's an effort to try to find Jewish gravestones and to put them together in some sort of museum, because what had happened is many of these gravestones were being used for washing clothes by the local Chinese. And Dvir has made this his mission to try to find these and to put them all together.
Let me speak to that. That there's a sad history to that. That during the communist era, most of the Jewish cemeteries were vandalized, and the gravestones were often used for construction in the communist era. To their credit, the Chinese, when the communist era ended, were extremely embarrassed by that, because they also venerate their ancestors the way we do. And they were very embarrassed, but they acknowledged that such atrocities did happen. As I said, we filled 3 cemeteries. When I returned, the cemeteries had been turned over to, I guess, industrial uses of one kind or another. Interestingly enough, there was the Sassoon family and others helped build the, as I called it, the Shanghai Jewish Youth Association, the SJWA school, which was a very nice structure, kind of a U-shaped structure with classrooms on either side, and in the center there was an assembly hall. And I was shocked to find out that that had been destroyed after the war, because it was a perfectly wonderful school building where before I went to the yeshiva, we had a secular school. And frankly, the foundation of my English, which I speak with some fluency now, came from attending the Shanghai Jewish Youth Association school for 3 years. I learned enough over there to become a voracious reader. And even when I was in the yeshiva, I did a great deal of reading. I think my yeshiva teachers were not happy to know that I also read a lot of fiction. And we had a Jewish the refugees had a lending library. And I read voraciously from the lending library, both in German and in English. And when I came to the United States, I was very fluent in English and in reading. I must say, my handwriting has not improved any. So I welcome the use of computers and typewriters, which made it possible to me to communicate more readily.
Very good. Thank you. And of course, just a quick comment, as we know in Europe, one of the ways the Germans showed disrespect for the Jews was to pull up the gravestones and pave roads with them. Another question in the chat: as a psychologist, are you bitter about your childhood? And also, would you say it impacted either positively or negatively on your later life?
Well, I can't be bitter about my childhood because my parents did the best they all possibly could for me. As I said to you, I would have little bits of butter and they had margarine. I remember during the war, the bread we had was awful because very often it was poorly baked and there were worms inside it. And so, being in the war situation, you cut out the worms and you ate the rest. And my parents did their best for me, and I'm eternally grateful to them for the fact that we have survived. It was difficult. But in Yiddish, there's an expression, Ayid helft sich, which means Jews help themselves to the best they can. And we lived through difficult times. And I can't say that I'm bitter. If I'm bitter, the bitterness had to do with the Germans, of course, because the Japanese actually treated us correctly. They didn't treat us well. They didn't treat us benevolently. But if they had decided to follow the German guy's advice and sink us in the Yellow Sea, no one would have cared. And it is to their credit, and they knew we were defenseless, and they knew that they would suffer no consequences if they did away with us. And they didn't treat us well, but they didn't treat us as harshly as they could have. Compared to what our life was like in Germany, our life in Shanghai was a heaven. Because, as I said, no one was lined up. There were no concentration camps. There were no gas chambers. People were not killed. If you people were imprisoned and ended up dying out of typhoid. But in general, the Japanese treated us correctly. They were also relatively benevolent, as I understand it, to the American and British. After the war, as I indicated, I had some surgery, and I ended up being in a hospital in a semi-private room with a young man who was half Russian, half American. He was telling me that in their concentration camps, they also played baseball with the Japanese captors. One of the things he learned from that is, I suspect, that the commanding officer of the Shanghai area was relatively benevolent, because even the British and the Americans who were interned were treated reasonably well. I don't mean that, you know, that they had no troubles. Obviously, we all had a hard time. But given what we've heard about what happened in Hong Kong and Singapore, Shanghai, people were treated well. And I think the moral of that story is that, and I don't know who the commanding officer or general was, but the commanding Japanese officer must have been a reasonably benevolent man who treated American prisoners and the Jewish refugees correctly. Had he been a brutal beast, I would not be.
Thank you. Before I turn the program over to Al Tridell for closing remarks, are there any other questions? I think we have time for one more. Does anyone wish to raise a hand? Or if there's anyone with their camera off who would like to ask a question, just unmute yourself. I see none, so I will now turn this program over to Al Tridell for closing remarks. Al?
Thanks, Joel. First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Tobias for an absolutely enlightening presentation today. Very few of us knew that much about the Shanghai Ghetto. Many people perhaps didn't even know that it was a haven for Jews during the Second World War. I found out today that Professor Tobias and I share a common friend who happened to have also been in the Shanghai Ghetto, and his older brother was Professor Tobias's best friend. So it really is a small world. I also had a great aunt and a great uncle who actually left Germany with their 3-year-old son on the Trans-Siberian Railroad and made their way through Shanghai to the United States to get here. So certainly they knew of Shanghai. They didn't say very, very much, to say the least. But this was just an incredible presentation. We all thank you for sharing your knowledge of the ghetto and your experiences there. We hope that you'll be a frequent visitor and friend here at Beth Shalom, and we hope you'll come back again often so that we can welcome you here and you can become a member of our community, at least on an honorary basis. So by all means, you know, come early and often.
May I respond to that? Can you hear me?
Sure can.
Okay. One of the things that I miss in Kol Neshama is we don't do the Haftorah. And I love the trap of the Haftorah. So if you will honor me every once in a while in inviting me to do a Haftorah, I would be very grateful, because I love the trap. And I very much enjoy being in your show, which I think is one of the nicest shows in the area from what I can tell. Okay.
Yeah.
Our ritual vice president is right here. Did you get all of that, Susan? And I'm sure that we'll find a way of including you in doing Haftarot many times over. So please don't be a stranger here, and we hope to see you often.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Al. Thank you again, Professor Tobias, for an amazing, compelling presentation. And with that, I thank everyone for joining us this morning. Hope you have a pleasant day. Get out there. It's really nice out.
Let me
Stay
thank
well.
everyone. Let me thank everyone for listening. It was a pleasure to speak to you.
Was very nice.
Thank you.